If you were with us this morning for our Bible class hour, then you've already had the opportunity to hear our speaker for this morning's service. He hails from Oklahoma. He is a Sooner. I find myself a Longhorn being surrounded by Oklahomans. I don't understand that. Anyway, but we're glad to have him with us. He is coming from Freed-Hardeman University. He is faculty there in the graduate school. Brother Rick Brumback began his education in bomb physics and was working for the DoD, the Department of Defense, working at HURD, High Explosive Research Development Facility at Eglin Air Force Base. Began his graduate studies in bomb physics. Then he changed his mind in his career course and went to preaching school. From there, he became the director of the Southwest School of Bible Studies, was there for some period of time. At the same time, finished up his PhD in early church history. And after that, he went to Freed-Hardeman University and has been faculty there for approximately 5 years. It doesn't take a bomb physicist to understand the gospel, but if we need one, we've got one. I encourage you to give your attention this morning to Brother Rick Brumback.
People ask me what it's like to work in high explosives research and development, and I just told them, well, it's a blast. I love it. I'm sorry, that's as good as it gets for the entire week. So my sons, I have two sons, they asked me when they were little, they said, Dad, how do we become a bomb scientist? And I said, how is your math homework today and your science homework? Silence. And they never asked me that question again. Neither of them are anywhere near doing that today. For all of that and the excitement of going to work every day to blow things up without having the authorities called on you, is great to be able to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's my pleasure to be able to be with all of you and to be with the Blackmers. I appreciate their hospitality, even though Chance is making me sleep on a bed with Texas Longhorn sheets and pillowcases. It's okay after yesterday. Today we have the privilege of being able to talk about arguably the person who is the most incredible in all of human history, and that is Jesus the Christ. I realize that our time could be spent talking about the reality of Jesus' existence. There are occasionally persons who challenge that and say that Jesus never really lived or did what he said or is said to have done. But there is a great deal of investigation of that, and every claim ends up being defensible. We know from the Bible text, we also know from ancient contemporary texts by non-Christians that Jesus lived when the Bible tells us he lived. He died the way that the Bible tells us he died, and that he had this influence that the Bible tells us that he had. So rather than address the topic, did he really exist, we take that as an established fact. But if we look at it from a different direction, the influence and work of Jesus the Christ and its impact upon our world, I'd like for us to recognize that he has left the single largest influence, benefit, fingerprints of his activity are all over human history in the intervening centuries. It is not an exaggeration to say he's the most influential person in history. But with our topic today, A World Without Jesus, what I'd like for us to do is turn this around. How do we discuss what it would be like to have a world in which Jesus did not come? A world in which Jesus did not teach, set an example, or try to promote the best for all of human living. And it seems to me that the best way to approach this is to imagine what would be lost, considering the positive things that would be taken away from our world if Jesus had not come. What is it that he's provided that you and I can take refuge in, that our world even acknowledges, even by those persons who are hostile toward the Christian faith? Think, for example, about the ways that his teachings impact our world every day. Did you know that all 50 states in the United States have some form of the Good Samaritan law in their legal codes? Protection for people who are trying to do right, come to someone's aid as they come upon a scene where they can render assistance. But it is not an accident that all of those are referred to as Good Samaritan laws. It's because the impact, of course, is drawn from Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan found in Luke chapter 10, specifically in verses 29 through 37. There was a person who was himself hostile to Christ, trying to trap him, and asked what the greatest commandments were, and Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Actually, the man said it, Jesus affirmed. But then the man asked the question, kind of trying to find an out, a loophole. And he said, well, who's my neighbor? Who do I really have to spend energy on, and who can I dismiss and walk away and feel okay about that? And then Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. By the time that he was done, he concluded in verse number 20 or verse 37 by saying, now you go and do likewise. That type of benevolent care for the situations of other people, even those we don't know, coming to their rescue, would be lost from our collective consciousness or awareness had Jesus not come in and raised this into our vision to say this is how we live as fellow citizens of the human race in our world. It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter when, and it doesn't matter who that other person is. It is about who we are. But if you take Jesus away, 50 states lose the Good Samaritan laws or rules, and we lose this awareness. I have a role to play in helping those who are around me. Very closely tied to that. How about what I would consider maybe the most comprehensive ethical statement on living that has ever been voiced? You might know that as the Golden Rule. In Matthew 7 and verse 12, Jesus talked and he said that people, whatever we would have them do unto us, we ought to do unto them. A very positive statement. Now, I've had some friends of mine who are very critical of Christianity look and say, well, that didn't originate with Jesus. And I asked, well, where else do we find this? And they mentioned the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius. And they said, well, Confucius said that, and so I looked at it, and actually he did not. Confucius gave what is sometimes called the silver rule. It's valuable, I suppose, but it does not reach the level of what Jesus said. Actually, what Confucius said was, if you don't want people to do it to you, then don't do it to them. Okay, we might say that to our kids, and they're bickering or fussing or something like that. But Jesus, his statement is so much better. Because from a positive angle, he asks us to be thoughtful about the good that we can do, not just the absence of evil or malice, but the good. So the Golden Rule lifts us up and asks us to consider the person in their shoes. How can I be of benefit, and how do I make sure that I treat them, because that's exactly the way that I would like to be treated in response. The Golden Rule says Jesus has had an impact. Here's one that maybe people wouldn't necessarily think about. How about architecture? Architecture. How did Jesus influence architecture? Well, in John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, Jesus was addressing Jewish crowds, and he said, if you continue in my words, my teachings, then are you my disciples indeed, truly. And he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Great statement about following Christ's teaching. Taking classes there. It is an outstanding educational institution. It's considered one of the public Ivies, a public version of the Ivy League colleges. If you go into the quad or the open area there and you look up at the main building, on the facade above all of the columns, there is this inscription, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Now, the preceding words are not there. Jesus saying, if you want to be my disciples, continue in my words. And interestingly, there is no citation. It's funny, I always kind of laughed at the professors. If a student didn't give a citation in quoting somebody in a research paper, they get downgraded for plagiarism. And yet here it is on the top of this facade with no attribution. Those words are spoken by Jesus. It is not just about doing well in our nursing studies or English classes or engineering. Jesus speaks to them about knowing how to. Of course, in talking about Christ, we couldn't leave out the scenes of the crucifixion on Mount Calvary, but I am going to step over that for right now because that's the basis of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I invite you to be back tonight as we talk about his great love and sacrifice. What about how Jesus counseled people to deal with those who are sometimes troublesome or challenging or difficult? Because he had a great deal to say. We have phrases when we speak about someone who's wronged us, and we talk about how we're going to reply back to them. We have phrases like, don't get mad, get even. Right? We talk about revenge. People talk about revenge. Get even. People will couch them in very urbane terms like, revenge is a dish best served cold. You see, that sounds so much more civilized, but really it's the same thing. I knew of a fellow one time who said if they did that to me, I'd slash the tires on their car. Did you know that among movies and television programs and books that are produced in the United States, the number one theme, most often hit upon and usually among the biggest draws, are movies and stories that have to do with revenge being exacted upon someone who's wronged the protagonist. There's a television program called Revenge. One word captures it all. Well, it's easy for people to think about that, maybe default to how that's the way to interact, but that is not at all what Jesus taught. He lifted up the bar to a more noble level by speaking explicitly on how we are to treat our enemies and those who are bad to us, to our families, the bullies who trouble our children, the coworkers who are unkind, the people in our neighborhood who make cutting remarks about us and worse. In Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, verses 43 through 48, he explicitly addresses that. And he doesn't say get revenge. He doesn't say wait until they're not expecting it, serve it cold, it's the best that way. He doesn't. What he says is that we're to pray for those who despitefully use us. We are to enact good to the people who are not at all good to us. And you can imagine someone hearing him in that Sermon on the Mount and looking at him and saying, did I hear him say that right? Did I mishear? He just said, I need to be good. I need to pray for. I need to look at ways to benefit others when they're bad to me. And if someone had challenged Jesus on that, I could imagine that spurring the words that he follows with when he says, the Father above behaves just that way. He says, the Father causes the rain to fall on both the just and the unjust. The sunshine, today is beautiful, by the way. It is a gorgeous day and first day of the week. That sunshine is falling not only upon God's saints, but it's falling upon people who have no affiliation, maybe want no affiliation with God. That blessing is universally dispersed. And the reason Christ mentioned that is because of his encouragement. We need to be people of lofty character, benevolent and positively minded, irrespective of who it is that we're interacting with. It's not about how good they are. It's about who I want to be as a disciple of Jesus the Christ. Even if you go many decades later in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, there is a section that is recalled by Peter. Peter who walked with Jesus. Peter who saw him affixed to the cross. And as Peter is writing in that passage to talk about how to treat others and behave, even when those in authority over us are being abusive and unkind, he lifts up Jesus as his example and says, here is our model. In fact, he says he's left us an example to follow. And it's interesting to me that in the context, he's not saying just an example to follow in being good to your parents, an example to follow in, contributing generously or whatever the case. He's thinking about a very specific situation. Oh, it's true, Christ gives us examples in other areas, but he's thinking about what when people don't treat us well. He says that's the time that we need the footsteps of Jesus that we can walk in, because it is so easy to do something less, base, wrong. That's the Christ that we serve. He teaches people to be better than their circumstances or surroundings, including how we treat those who are unkind to us, our children, our loved ones, and others. I suppose very closely connected to that would also be a consideration of how often we extend forgiveness to people who have wronged us. In Matthew chapter 18, Peter had come to Jesus and asked him this question in verses 21 and 22. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother? He sinned against me. 7 times 7? Maybe there was a thought in his or common thinking, the minds of, there's a limit. There are a number of times my family member, my friend, my brother, another person will come to me and say, I'm very sorry, Rick, I should not have done that. Please accept my apology. Okay. But it gets harder sometimes for people when we're being asked by the same person, same basic idea, 3rd time, 5th time, 6th time. And maybe sometimes people are minded to think, well, there's a limit on how often I'm going to say, I forgive you. Everything is well. But Christ is not that way. Instead, he said in hyperbole or exaggeration, he said until 7 times 70. That's 490 times. And I know that he was not saying to Peter, but time number 491, brother, you are out. That is not what he's saying. He's setting the number so high, it's as if he's saying there's no limit on how often we should be willing to extend forgiveness when someone has wronged us and ask for our forgiveness. It's an interesting thing to me when he was teaching in Matthew chapter 6 on how to pray, verses 9 down through 13, and subsequent remarks in 14 and 15. The one area that he gave the most attention to was forgiveness. He gives this model prayer, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, give us this day our daily bread, and so, but forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. I wonder if Jesus knew that people struggle. I admit it, I struggle sometimes with the challenge getting my mind right to interact with another person properly. Because he actually goes farther past the end of that model. He gives a rationale in verses 14 and 15, and he simply says, look, if we're not willing to forgive when other people are sorry, they're penitent, they're wanting to make amends, how in the world can we expect our Father to be like that to us? If I'm not willing to give it, I have no right to ask for it and expect to receive it. Multiple ways and places, Jesus said we are to be peacemakers where possible. In fact, in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And who said it but the Son of God, the very Prince of Peace himself? A world without Jesus is an intolerant world. And a world without Jesus is one that does not have highlighted for us the thought, I need to be a bridge builder, not a destroyer. I need to be loving, not hating. I need to be forgiving, not vengeance-filled. How about this? How about the fact that Jesus was a figure who welcomed all types of people? It's amazing to me how good people of every generation are, anywhere in the world, any century, it doesn't matter, how good we are as humans to divide the world into 2 categories, the us's and the them's. And usually the them's, we might get along okay, but not always. And it's easy for the us's to pick on the them's sometimes, depending on who they are or what they are. They cheer for a different team. They live in a different state. They vote differently. They speak a different language. They look differently. They behave differently. It's so easy for the world to drop things into those categories. We like our own. We don't necessarily like the other. That's common human outlook. But Jesus explodes all of that. If you read through the gospel accounts, especially the book of Luke, because there's such a variety found there, what I love about Jesus is that he has a heart and a mind that are large enough to see the worth and value in every person, no matter where they come from, what they look like, how they sound, what their religion is, what their behavior is like. I'm not suggesting that he always approved every choice or decision. He did not. But that also reminds us that we can be principled people holding to God's objective truth and at the same time be people of noble character who treat others in a welcoming way. In John chapter 4, Jesus had gone through Samaria and he stopped by a well. And there was a woman who was drawing some water there and he asked her for a drink. And it's amazing to me that we learned something about the social fabric, the way people behaved in that time, because she was a bit flabbergasted, it looks like. She said, "How is it? I don't understand this. You're a Jewish man, and you are asking a drink, a favor, interacting with me, a woman who is a Samaritan." Now, we know from historical records and biblical accounts that Samaritans and Jews didn't always get along well. In fact, there was a very strong us-them mentality on both sides. And so first she's amazed that Jesus is speaking so nicely, interacting with someone from the other group. But to Jesus, she wasn't from the other group. She was a person. Then she seems kind of amazed that in that ancient setting, here's a man that doesn't know her, and yet he's talking to her and asking her a favor, and she's a bit, surprised. But I don't think that Jesus saw a woman per se. He saw a person. If he had seen something differently, behaved differently, the rest of the chapter would not have unfolded the way that it did. They had a conversation about her marital status and her lifestyle choices. They had a conversation about religious accuracy and truth. And because he saw a person and dealt with her in a loving way, in a principled way, but a decent way, by the time they were done, she left his company, went back to her community, and she says, "I have found this Christ, this Messiah that we have been told to expect." And she pointed, and others came and found Jesus, verified her words, and the entire community was blessed. If he had been prejudiced, biased, if he had been short on attention, he had been dismissive, none of that would happen. But Jesus welcomed people no matter their background. Or you could talk about children. You watch families being together, maybe a family reunion. We get together, we like to, our family, maybe yours as well. In some ways, it's easy to see children kind of, shh and set aside while the adults are talking, right? And sometimes, I can remember this, right, my own childhood. Sometimes you just want to interact. You might even have something you think, at 7 is important that the adults need to hear, and yet shunt it aside a little bit. But not so with Jesus. You have accounts of Jesus talking about little children and the composition of the kingdom of heaven in Matthew 18. But there's another 18. This 18 is Luke chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. There were families just like this. There are a lot of kids in here, babies small. It's lovely. It's lovely. If Jesus were nearby, would you bring your children over and say, "You need to meet him"? Would you ask Jesus, "Would you please bless my child"? Put your hand on my child's head and say a benediction. In Luke chapter 18, people were bringing their children for that very purpose. And the apostles step up, and I'm not trying to fault them too heavily, but maybe they represent, kind of my or others' adult view, which is, these little people, just later. We've got important business to deal with right now. And Jesus stopped them right there. And that's when he uttered those very famous words, "Let these little children come to me." He not only saw worth, but in what I could imagine were busy days, hectic days at times, he had no difficulty carving out time to attend to them and say, "They are important in my world." and then to hold him up and speak about the value of a childlike, not childish, childlike perspective that he would like all people to possess. What an amazing figure who went against, I would guess, just normal practice and said, I have time for these little guys too, and they're important. As you read through the rest of the gospel accounts, here is Jesus who has time for lepers. He doesn't shush them, even though they're on the margins. They were in the ancient world, by the way, known as the living dead. They were alive, but because of their diseases, multiple forms of leprosy or what fall into that category, they could not come in with the average persons. They had to stay on the outside. Jesus talked to them. He dealt with people from Gentile worlds, a Syrophoenician woman. He interacted with a Roman centurion. Boy, I'll tell you, in the ancient world, the Jews hated the Romans as a whole. And the Romans didn't much care for the Jews either, thought they were a problem. They're just a thorny problem. But in Matthew chapter 8, just after the Sermon on the Mount, a Roman centurion came up to Jesus and said, I have a servant who is ill, and I know that you have the power to help my servant and heal him. Would you be willing to do so? Here's Jesus once again, a same hectic figure, maybe having a number of persons pulling him in different directions. And what does he do? He says, sure, I'll do it. Lead on. Where's your house? And I love the fact the Roman centurion said, no, just stop right there. And he said, I know that you have the power to do this, and you do not have to come to my house. He said, I'm a person of authority. He said, I give the orders, and my soldiers, I say froggy, they say how high. He said, all you have to do is say the word, and this will be taken care of. There are 2 times in the gospel accounts that Jesus is described as being amazed, gobsmacked, maybe, a little English, not so Greek, right? But amazed. And both times he's talking to a Gentile figure, one of whom was this Roman centurion. And he said, you get it. It's as if he says that. And he healed this man's servant. Jesus had a heart that was big enough to help him allow entrance by people of all backgrounds. And do we, as his people, have a similar disposition, similar capacity in our hearts, our emotions, our compassions? We should. And if we were talking about a world without Jesus, we would be removing all of that. I'm not suggesting that there aren't compassionate people in the world, that Jesus is the only one. I'm not suggesting that he's the only figure who has occasionally had these observations that are helpful advice for living. I know that. But he is both the fullest embodiment of all of those best qualities, and he's also the most effective teacher of all of those same qualities. No piece of advice that he ever gave is wrong or needs to be modified or adjusted or improved upon. There's no supplement that is needed for Jesus and for his teachings on how to do the business of life. I don't want to take him out of the world. I want the world to see him more fully and to walk in his footsteps. Our families will be better. Our churches will be better. Our communities will be advantaged. Our country, the world is better by listening to the words of Jesus the Christ. Why take him away? He needs to be more fully brought in and followed. There's never going to be a person that gets to the end of their life and looks back and says, wow, I spent too much time following Jesus. Nobody ever says that. Nobody's going to come up to the edge of eternity and say, wow, I was just too concerned with what God had to say about the business of life. No one is going to say that. But on the flip side, there may be people who say, I wish I had listened more. I wish I had redeemed the time better. I wish that I had enacted the teachings of Jesus more fully in my life and left a wake of positivity and advantage wherever I went. And Jesus wants that for every person worldwide throughout all the years. We're going to do a little quiz here as we bring things to a close. A little quiz. And I'm going to mention a religion, a world religion, and I want you to think in your mind about where you or an average person would associate a home place for that religion. Somebody on the street. Like, for example, if I were to say Judaism, okay, many people would immediately have their mind think to Jerusalem and Israel. Or maybe some neighborhoods in major metropolitan areas, a high concentration of Orthodox Jewish figures, right? If I say Islam, you think, I don't know, somewhere in the Middle East perhaps, although worldwide footprint, no doubt. I say Buddhism, and you say the Far East maybe, in California, right? Okay. I say Christianity, and the average person thinks North America, and not just anywhere in North America or the United States, but where? The Bible Belt, and oftentimes American citizens only. Now, that may be what some think, but there's no question that that is a wrong assessment, or at least it should not be perceived in that way. When Jesus spoke the Great Commission statements found at the end of all 4 gospel accounts, he's already died and been resurrected. We'll talk about that tonight. And he knows that what he's done essentially is throw the doors to heaven open for the possible entrance of any man or woman or child, no matter where they live, no matter what language they speak, what they look like, what they have or don't have, it does not matter. It is opening an all-inclusive invitation. That is why Christianity should be looked at as heaven's religion with a global scope. That is the nature of the Christ whom we know and serve. He is welcoming every person who will respond into the hallways of heaven and his presence forever. I know you and I do not have the ability to speak for everyone else, maybe not even the people down the street or even some of the members of our own families, but we can speak for us, we who are here in this room today. What significance does Jesus have in your life? Do you live by the words that he's taught? Do you follow in the footsteps for all the best examples that he has left for us? At the end of the day, when you put your head on your pillow, do you utter prayers perhaps to heaven, knowing that you are a born-again child of God, having been baptized into Christ, all of the guilt, all of the ugly washed away, and knowing I am a disciple of the greatest person who has ever walked the earth? That should be the goal of every person in this room. I wish it were the aim of every person who draws breath wherever they may be. But today you have the power to speak for you. It may be that you are with us this morning as a visitor. We are so thankful for your presence. We hope that you'll be here every time we meet this week and beyond. We're going to enjoy worshiping and considering some of these thoughts together. But today the most important thing is that when we leave these rooms and go out these doors, that we do so as Christians. And so we're going to issue heaven's invitation. And if you are not a New Testament Christian, having been born again, baptized into Christ, this is the time to do that and to say, my world is not going to be without Jesus. You can be forgiven and have a new life start. This morning we'd love to do nothing more than to help you be at peace with God in heaven through Jesus Christ. And if we can assist you in any way, becoming a Christian or making changes, all we need for you to do is tell us as we stand together sing our invitation.